Welcome to The Source, where we combine the headlines with in-depth conversations with the newsmakers themselves. Today on the program, 2 years after a historic ruling at The Hague.
There are many ways of enforcing the award or parts of the award without going to war with China.
China still keeps a military presence in disputed waters.
Given the wishy-washy approach to diplomacy, I think we're much weaker now than we were before.
The government insists they aren't sacrificing independence.
We filed dozens of protests.
So would it be more than 50? I mean, an approximate, sir?
Of both verbal and
written?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to distinguish both. What, sir? What's yes?
More than 50.
More than 50 na.
But a lawmaker wants the government to bear its diplomatic protests against China.
What are these? At ano yung mga results that these have actually generated?
Also, as the government pushes for federalism, we look at some of the provisions of the proposed federal constitution. Former Solicitor-General Florin Hilbay joins us live. And later, have a better travel experience with his new airport robot. That's for today's In Focus. Thank you for joining us. Sitting in for Pinky Web, I'm Ruth Cabal. It's been 2 years since the Philippines won its landmark arbitration case against China in The Hague in the Netherlands. The decision, the country has exclusive sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea and declares China's 9-line claim invalid. Despite calls from critics and opposition lawmakers for the government to take a stronger stance against the Eastern giant, the president himself says he will raise the arbitral ruling at the right time, and the country cannot afford to go to a war. Let's go straight to the source of the story, former Solicitor-General Florin Hilbay. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Ruth.
Sir, so this week, 2 years since The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines over a maritime dispute against China. Where are we? Do you even see the Philippines benefiting from this ruling?
We haven't really benefited from it. That is why today is both a happy and a sad day. Happy because we remember that momentous day when we won our rights over the West Philippine Sea. We're very sad, disappointed, and frustrated precisely because of the position of the government, which is not simply defeatist, but actually in many instances pro-China.
When you say defeatist, pro-China, on your part, sir, what does it mean to say that we're actually implementing the ruling?
We aren't implementing the ruling. The government hasn't taken any steps to implement the ruling. In fact, it's taken steps to justify its failure or even refusal to implement the ruling. We can look at several aspects. For example, number one, the refusal to invoke the arbitral award in any way, not even formally. We haven't seen any evidence that they have really done that.
When you say that, sorry sir, when you say that, do you want to see structures? Ano po bang dapat nakikita natin? May mga,
at the minimum, what we'd like to see is simply consistent complaints, formal complaints on the part of the government. The government, through the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, said he's complained 50, 100, even more times. But he hasn't really shown us any specific documents where he raised any portion of the decision. And so we're faced with the possibility that even the Secretary of Foreign Affairs is lying just to justify the failure to invoke the decision.
Professor, let's just go back to what Secretary Cayetano said about that.
So what I can tell you is not only are we taking all diplomatic action, but we've filed dozens of protests.
So would it be more than 50? I mean, an approximate, sir?
Of both verbal and
written?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to distinguish both. What, sir? What's yes?
More than 50.
More than 50 na.
So that's what you want to see?
Yes, of course, because we're not really sure whether he made the protest in the first place. And the best evidence of those protests would be documents saying that we are invoking the decision, certain portions of the dispositive of the decision. We've never seen that. No? And therefore, we we can assume that he hasn't really done that.
Kasi sir, kahit si Senator Risa Ontiveros is planning to file a resolution to see those documents. So pag ganun ba, how does it go? Confidential ba yung mga ganong documents when you say it's a diplomatic protest? Ano po bang nature nun?
Well, some portions may be confidential, but the portions of any of those protests where he invokes a specific language of the decision, saying, for example, that on this particular matter, this is what the ruling says,
yes.
then the decision is a public document. Portions of their complaint where they invoke portions of that public document should not be confidential at all.
So what do you plan? Ikaw, sir, on your part, formal petition?
We have, in fact, been thinking of filing a case before the Supreme Court to specifically compel the Department of Foreign Affairs to show any of these protests, because we're looking at the possibility that the government's policy here is one of waiver or estoppel. No? China knows it's lost the case, and it's still party to the own clause, which means that that's the greatest evidence that it is bound and knows that it continues to be bound by that decision. And so if I were China or one of the lawyers of China, my policy would be to try to find a way by which the other side, the Philippines, would end up waiving the decision, which would be very unfortunate for us Filipinos, because we're waiving rights that transcend generations, that involve our maritime security, our territorial integrity, and of course the sovereignty of the Republic.
So at this point in time, would you say now we're actually going towards possibility of waiving that right? With the way the government is moving now, is acting now?
Well, that's one way to construe the policy of the government, because number one, the president himself, the highest official of the land, refuses to invoke and always keeps on delaying and delaying and delaying. So he says, at some point before I end my term, but when will this term end? When will that happen in the first place? When the easiest thing to do is just file a piece of paper, right? Make it public and invoke the decision. They've never done that.
But on your point na parang laging ganyan ang statement ni Pangulo, and then China also saying they want bilateral talks na lang daw. Should we even go that path? Well,
bilateral talks are dangerous because that's a boxing match between two fighters belonging to different weight classes. No? And so it's like Manny Pacquiao and Mike Tyson, right? So we've always strived to go for a multilateral talks, precisely because we can increase the bargaining position of the Philippines by joining together with other smaller countries, which have similar converging interests on the matter.
Pero yung balikan ko yung sinabi niyo about the president, do you think yung apparent inaction ba ng presidente, what kind of violation, or what do you see with that? Is there even a violation for that?
Well, I'd say that's a culpable violation of the Constitution. It's a betrayal of public trust. Although, of course, politically it might be difficult to impeach him given the strength of his numbers in the Congress. But there's no doubt in my mind, as a constitutionalist, as the agent who served as counsel for the Republic, that these are clear betrayals of the public trust.
In what way, sir?
Territorial integrity is fundamental. National security, our energy security, our maritime wealth, that's fundamental to the protection of the nation. And that's part of the things that the Constitution protects, and the President swore an oath to protect the Constitution. His failure, if not refusal, to protect the national security, marine wealth, and our energy sector is a clear violation of the Constitution.
Okay, moving on lang, sir, kanina, fresh na fresh, you posted on your Facebook this photo of an, there's a banner in one of the areas here in Metro Manila, parang pinapakita daw dyan na, can we have that photo up, please? Yung kanina lang doon, sir, diba?
Right.
What was that
I
about?
saw one on Philcoa on the way here.
Ano po yung nakita nyo? We're trying to retrieve the photo.
It talks about, it's a large tarpaulin, right? Welcome to the Philippines province of China. Whatever the motive may have been to do it, it's really not funny because
kanina lang yan, sir?
Today,
yeah.
I saw it on the way here. Whatever, like I said, whatever the motives may be, it's really not funny, especially on this particular day. No?
So wala pa tayong detalye kung sino kaya naglagay niyan or ano, di ba?
None.
But anyway, in a related topic, yung militarization naman in the South China Sea, we have in Sandy Cay and Woody Island, Acting Chief Justice Antonio Carpio is saying that if we allow this, we could lose big portions of our territory. Let's first listen to his statement.
Yes, it's very important because if we don't control, if we lose Sandy Cay, we lose 1/3 of the territorial sea of Pag-asa.
Right.
We lose Subi Reef.
Yeah.
And the tribunal said Subi Reef is part of our territorial sea. That's why we are worried. That is militarizing the South China Sea already. It's not. We are not claiming Woody Island or the Parasols, but they will use Woody Island to enforce the 9-dash line, and that means we will lose 80% of our exclusive economic zone. That's huge.
So what do you think of the statement of the Chief Justice?
Actually, if you look at the decision itself, one of the reasons for the tribunal deciding the case in our favor or this assuming jurisdiction in the first place is the commitment of China, President Xi Jinping himself, not to militarize the South China Sea. We know now that notwithstanding our friendly relationship with China, China has in fact militarized the area. All the militarization in the South China Sea happened in the last 2 years. So it reflects badly on the administration's policy of friendliness because it has made China, in fact, even more aggressive because we haven't pushed back in any way.
That's the area where we saw the bombers, di ba? Yung Chinese bombers in that area sa may Sandy Cay.
No. It's in many of the areas where they have created islands, including Mischief Reef, which is 125 nautical miles away from the Philippines.
Pero ang sinasabi nila aside from yung narinig natin na reports from the fishermen of alleged harassment doon ng Chinese Coast Guard, why would Filipinos care about this issue? Kasi parang malayo naman sa atin yan. Anong interest ng public dyan?
Well, our fisher folk, for example, are heavily affected. That subsistence fishing. And one of the wins that we got from the tribunal was the recognition that our Filipino fishermen have traditional fishing rights in, say, Scarborough Shoal.
Yes.
Right? And that's where they get their food. That's not commercial level. That's subsistence fishing. And so it strikes directly at the gut. Diretso sa tiyan ng ating mga mamamayan, ng ating mga mangingisda na nakadepende yung pagkain at kabuhayan nila doon sa mga isdang nahuhuli doon sa lugar na yun.
Pero kung ako naman yung isang Pilipino na I will take yung statement ni President Duterte na hindi natin kaya makipaggera sa China ngayon.
That's a false claim because number one, we're asking for a minimum which is to invoke the decision. During the last administration where we fought for our rights, where we filed a case, nobody ever talked about war. Nobody ever talked about war. And we were, in fact, very strong in our defense of our rights. Here we're asking for very minor things, which is to find ways by which we can move forward by filing protests before China. Filing a protest is the most civilized way to do between friends. Note also that even China doesn't have an interest in destabilizing the South China Sea. That's $5 trillion worth of trade. And any war in that area will affect China first and foremost. So no one is interested in war in the area. Not the United States, not the Philippines, not China. Well, only the president is actually trying to impose fear on the citizens, which is his way actually to justify the pro-China policy of his government.
You mentioned that it was in the Aquino administration when the protest was filed. Pero if you monitored yung press conference po ng mga mangingisda doon sa Malacanang, they were saying na mas malala pa yung sitwasyon dati dahil halos hindi raw sila makalapit doon sa fishing grounds na binobomba daw sila ng mga Chinese Coast Guard. Mas gusto pa daw nila yung sitwasyon ngayon.
Right. But note also that from the standpoint of China, that is simply out of their goodwill. Right? What does that mean? It means that the rights of the Filipino fisher folk which we have won, are now simply permissions on the part of China. That means that China is treating the entire area as its own, that anytime they can shut down the area and prevent our fisher folk to engage in their livelihood, which is very unfortunate, because if the administration doesn't push for those rights, at some point those rights will be lost, and they will be lost forever.
Yun nga, parang pag gano'n na at some point those rights will be lost. Hanggang kailan ba tayo dapat mag-implement ditong Hague ruling? Up to which point?
We need to look at this with a long-term view. It took China about 75 years to get to where it is right now, starting with the 11 dashes in the 1940s. We need to have a vision that spans several generations, because this concern is generational. It doesn't stop with one generation and the next. So there has to be some kind of a consistency in the way we're trying to enforce our rights. And today's policy is really very dangerous for the current and future generations of Filipinos.
Okay, we'll talk next about federalism, Professor.
Okay.
This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Still to come, are Filipinos ready for a federal form of government? Former Solicitor-General Florin Hilbay will still be with us after the break. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. Our guest today, former Solicitor General Florin Hilbay. Professor, let's talk about federalism now. Yung question ko kanina dun sa ating break, do you think the Philippines is ready for federalism?
Well, the numbers show that Filipinos don't want it. 64% of Filipinos are against charter change. According to the listing of priorities, 15 items, charter change is the last at 3%. A precondition for understanding charter change would be to know the current constitution first. 75% of Filipinos are not familiar with the current constitution. What does that mean? That the agents of the people, right, are pushing an agenda that the people don't want. Something so fundamental as changing the constitution is rejected by the people, but being pushed so strongly by the president, who is not even the proposing entity under the constitution. It's either a Congress or a constitutional convention. And so obviously the interest of the president is entirely different from the interest of the people on this particular matter.
But generally, if you look at it, this should benefit especially a lot of people in the provinces because of the idea of decentralization under a federal government. But maybe it's just because of a matter of not understanding the concept?
Not really, because if the goal simply is to try to distribute resources, the president can do that now with a federalized budget. The budget is entirely within the control of the president. If he wants to give money to the provinces that are lagging behind, then put more money in the budget for those areas. We also have the local government code, whose basic principle is decentralization. If they implement the local government code, if they think the local government code is not sufficient, then they can amend it and amend it again to make it even more powerful and give more resources to the province. What they're using is the most extreme measure, which is to open up the entire charter for revision and allow all the other motives to come in, like what? Term extension, lifting of the nationalistic restrictions on our economy, right?
So, you mentioned na yung mga ganyang provisions. What do you think of the draft federal constitution? And recently, yung sinasabi din ng presidente na he wants the election of a transition president for 2019. That will cut short his term.
That's what he says. But whether Congress will in fact do that, whether he will instruct Congress to do something different is entirely a different matter. What's dangerous with the current draft is that it basically allows the transition government under this president to have all the powers of a revolutionary government. Exercise legislative powers, exercise even judicial powers. he can reorganize the entire government for 3 years. What does that mean? He can fire justices of the Supreme Court that he doesn't want, the current ombudsman, members of constitutional commissions, governors, mayors. He can do that under that transition
government.
And so that's the most dangerous thing that we can do right now.
So hindi kayo naniniwala dun sa gusto niyang mag-eleksyon na lang muna at gusto niya 2019 na lang siya?
I don't believe it, no, because it's clear that what they want simply is to bypass the elections next year and find a way by which they can extend their term. No,
parang yun yung agenda talaga, tingin nyo?
That has always been clear based on history. No, President Ramos wanted to extend his term, so he tried Chacha. The people stopped him. President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo tried to do it. The Supreme Court stopped her. Only President Marcos was the one who was successful because the 1935 Constitution limited his term. He did charter change, and he in fact violated the 1935 Constitution for him to be able to extend his term beyond the 2-year term that is allowed of him.
So, Professor, is there still a way to stop this, Cha-Cha train, this track to federalism?
Only
Supreme
the people
Court?
can stop it.
Okay.
I think if people speak loudly enough to communicate not just to the president but to all of his allies that this is too dangerous. We know that all you want is term extension, prevent an election next year. Then at some point, these people are going to listen because they will be held accountable down the line, and they don't want to be remembered for that by an angry population.
So what can the people do? File a petition? What are the options?
Well, right now it's for them to speak, to exercise the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. If at some point there's a case that can be filed, that should also be an option. That means that people should exercise all their constitutional options to stop what they don't want in the first place based on the numbers.
Kasi Professor, dito pa lang sa no-L scenario for 2019, House Speaker Alvarez also brought it up, di ba, na parang to give them more time daw to study the draft constitution. Sinasabi na rin ng ibang lawmakers, Senator Kiko Pangilinan, even Senate President Tito Soto, na under the constitution, there should be an election next year. So yun pa lang, do you see that problematic na rin, ano?
I think that's the real goal, to try to bypass the elections next year. I mean, especially with the dwindling numbers of the president. We know for a fact that after the first half of every administration, the president becomes a lame duck because everybody's looking at the next presidential elections already. They want to maintain control, and the best way to maintain control, the administration, the president, and his allies. That's always been the political context. It doesn't have to be President Duterte. Just by understanding the history of our politics, we know that every president will weaken in the second half of his or her term, which is why some presidents have actually thought of extending their term through charter change.
Yung isa lang sa medyo controversial na provisions dito, including lawless violence as grounds for martial law, kasi di ba dati rebellion, and then if the public requires it. So, what do you think of that?
Well, that's downright dangerous because it allows the president to have the power to impose unlimited martial law. The 1935 Constitution was abused by President Marcos because he triggered the imposition of martial law. The 35 Constitution allowed the president to impose martial law if there's an imminent threat of invasion or rebellion. The 87 Constitution deleted that phrase, and now, actually, based on the intent and jurisprudence, requires actual invasion or rebellion. If you allow the imposition of martial law based on lawless violence, then you're giving the president the license to declare martial law because some mayors and vice mayors were killed. That's lawless violence.
That can be used like the situation now, so pwedeng considered as lawless
if
violence.
If the president says, well, there's so much drugs in the area, a lot of people are killing one another, I'm going to impose martial law because there's lawless violence. And you cannot question that finding because that's the president's opinion. that means you're giving the president prior license to declare martial law anytime he wants.
So let's just monitor whatever's going on with this discussions on federalism, Professor. Very great talking to you. Very interesting points. Thank you to former Solicitor General Florin Hilbay. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Coming up, fly light and easy through the help of an airport robot. That's for today's In Focus.